Hello, it's Kath Berry here. What you're about to see is one of the most exciting things that's ever happened to me in my career as an acupuncturist, and that is an interview that I did with Giovanni Maciocia on the Amalfi Coast in Italy. It was such a privilege to be able to meet the man behind all of those textbooks, so I do hope you enjoy hearing his personal insights about the future of acupuncture profession.
Good morning, Giovanni, and thank you for being part of our interview. To get started, where are we right now?
We are in Pontone on the Amalfi Coast in Italy.
And how long have you been in this place in Pontone?
8 years. I bought a house here 8 years ago.
And how do you feel when you come here?
It's very relaxing, and it's a wonderful combination of relaxation and work, because it's a great place to write.
What sort of writing do you do when you're here?
When I come here, I'm usually by a coincidence in the late stages of finishing a book. So I've actually finished writing my last two books here. The one on the psyche and the one on the channels.
And so what was your first encounter with Chinese medicine?
My first encounter with Chinese medicine was a long time ago. And actually, I was thinking about it, I don't even remember exactly whether it was 1971 or 1970. Certainly 1971, so that makes it, 40 years. And that's when I started studying in England, that was. And at that time the study was still part-time study.
And what inspired you to study Chinese medicine?
I'd always been, from some strange reason, which I don't really know, even as a child, I was interested in Chinese culture and Chinese philosophy. Even as I was a student in Italy, I'd heard about the Tao Te Ching, and then I had treatment in England as a patient, and I was asking my acupuncturist lots of questions, and I bought a book at the time, which was a Felix Mann book. And so he noticed that I was very interested, and he said, "Why don't you study it?" And I didn't think it would be possible to study, because I didn't know it was part-time. And that's what I did. I started studying it. And when I started, it was like a hobby. I never thought it would be my profession.
And what changed for you?
Well, I got more and more deeply interested in it, and then I realized that it could be my profession. And that's when I started working for Dr. Van Buren as his assistant. In fact, I actually started working for him even before I graduated in 1973.
And could you describe that experience of working as an assistant to Dr. Van Buren?
Yeah, it was wonderful. He was very busy, had a busy practice. So I was thrown in at the deep end, because he had two rooms, and suddenly I was in the other room treating patients on my own. Of course, I could always go next door and ask him. And so it was an amazing start, for me to be so busy right from the beginning, and next to your teacher, in the clinic next to your teacher. And that was in England at the time, in a small town called Gerrards Cross.
And how was Chinese medicine perceived at that time?
At that time, I can say that if you asked most people in the streets, what do you think of acupuncture, they wouldn't know the word acupuncture, literally. I would say probably more than 90% of people wouldn't even know the word acupuncture. So we were really pioneers.
And you say you were in a busy clinic. What sort of things were you treating at the time?
The things we were treating at the time were no different than what I treated later on my own. Bee syndrome, there's a lot of bee syndrome in England due to the climate, headaches, gynecological, digestive, the usual things, skin diseases.
And so moving on from studying with Dr. Van Buren, how then did you move into formal study of Chinese medicine?
How did I move into formal studies of Chinese medicine? First of all, at the time there were no books. The only books in English were a book by a doctor from Taiwan called Dr. Wu Weiping, which is only a list of points with the indications, basically, nothing else. There was a chapter on the 5 elements at the back of the book, written by someone else, by a French doctor called Lavier, which was a translation of a Chinese book, which was also just a list of points with the indications. And because I read French, I tried to find as many books on acupuncture in French as I could, and I used to go to the Wellcome Institute library on a Saturday. And there were many more books in French than in English, by Van Guy, especially Van Guy and Chamfrot. And there was also, at the time, there was already a French translation of the Neijing by Chamfrot.
So when did more books start to be developed?
When did more books start to be developed? Much later. Much, much later. Not until the late 1980s, I would say.
And so how did you bridge the gap without, you had your clinical information and then minor textbooks. How were you able to...
How did I bridge the gap? As I said, the main instruments one was the French literature, and two, learning to read Chinese. I started teaching myself Chinese, and that was a turning point, being able to read, the Chinese books.
Could you tell us how you taught yourself Chinese?
How I taught myself Chinese? At that time, when I was studying Chinese, I wasn't as busy as I am now. I wasn't lecturing, I wasn't writing books, so I had much more time. And I just used the standard textbooks that they use in China, elementary Chinese, I think it was called, flashcards and tapes, audio tapes. And, to learn Chinese, there's a lot you can do on your own, in fact, because you just have to learn the characters and you have to memorize them. And there is not much a teacher can do for you. You just have to memorize them.
What were some other challenges that you faced as a student of Chinese medicine at that time?
The main challenges I faced as a student at that time, well, one, as I said, the lack of textbooks.
I might do that again. So what were the main challenges you faced as a student?
The main challenge I faced as a student, as I said, one was the lack of textbooks. And I would say that was the main one. I did not have the main challenge that most people have, is lack of practice and lack of feedback from a teacher. That I did not have, because I was very lucky to be working for Van Buren from the beginning with him next door. So from that point of view, that was great. But
what do you think the differences are between learning Chinese medicine then and learning Chinese medicine now?
The difference between learning Chinese medicine then and learning Chinese medicine now, the colleges now are far better than they were in my times. They have amazing curriculum and lots of clinical practice and many good teachers. But I must say that the challenges are the same, no matter how good the college is. They may have a fantastic curriculum. The main challenge is still diagnosis, and I find that that's still the main challenge. No matter how good curriculum the college has, that does not really help your diagnostic skills that much, because they're more clinical skills.
And so what would help that process of learning diagnosis to a high level?
What would help the process of learning diagnosis at a higher level? I think more clinical practice, more clinical sessions under the guidance of a skilled teacher.
What's the one part of diagnosis that you think your students you see have the most challenges with?
Yes, one of the challenges most students face nowadays, I think it depends on the countries, actually. It differs from country to country. And at the moment I'm living in the United States and teaching in the United States too. And I find that the main challenge is what we call pattern identification. Being able to distinguish the essential pattern and how patterns interact. And I also personally find that there is an overemphasis, especially in the United States, on liver cheese stagnation, which has become my bugbear. And liver cheese stagnation is kind of overemphasized as a pattern.
And so, within the diagnostic set of skills, what's the one area of need that most practitioners need more work with?
What is the one area that practitioners need more work with? I would say pulse diagnosis, probably. Because the longer I practice, even after 37 years, I'm still amazed how important pulse diagnosis is, and I rely on it more and more. And that's definitely the most difficult part of Chinese diagnosis by far. But I find that, students complain about pulse diagnosis and they say we don't have enough clinical practice, etc., etc. And the clinical practice in pulse diagnosis probably can never be enough. But I always tell them, before complaining about the clinical practice, you have to learn the pulse, the meaning of the pulse qualities by heart. There's no point in going to a clinic to do pulse diagnosis practice and you don't know how the wiry pulse feels. You have to know how that feels. You have to be able to describe it. It feels so and so, and it means so and so.
So where do you suggest practitioners go to learn this sort of information?
Where do I suggest that practitioners go to learn that information? There are many books now on pulse diagnosis, several books. There's one by Dr. Hammer, for example. There are many books on pulse diagnosis. And most people would say, oh yes, but that's theoretical. But my answer is that's the first step. You will not learn in the clinic if you don't know the pulse qualities absolutely by heart. What should they feel like and what they mean. And you'll be amazed, how many people, when I teach, I say, well, how does the wiry pulse feel? And they can't describe it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And so, Giovanni, given your prolific contribution to the area of Chinese medicine, what's your greatest achievement?
What is my greatest achievement? It's not up to me to say, really. I hope that it is adapting Chinese medicine to Western patients by keeping its roots. I was giving the commencement speech at the doctoral course graduation in the United States recently, and I identify that as connecting heaven and earth. By heaven I mean developing Chinese medicine to Western patients in ways that are different than they are from the classics. And by earth I mean keeping its roots, however, not keeping our feet on the ground. And I hope that's something I've managed to achieve.
And what are you passionate about?
What am I passionate about? Salsa.
Tell us about your salsa dancing.
Well, we'll leave that to another time, shall we, about the salsa dancing. But what I'm really passionate about recently, as you can probably see from the books propping up the microphone, is the philosophical background of Chinese medicine. And Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. This has completely absorbed me for the past 5-6 years. The philosophical influence of Chinese medicine, which I think has been kind of misunderstood. Most people think the Neijing, for example, is a Taoist classic. Very frequently you see it described as such. It's not. It's a Confucianist stroke legalist classic, and hardly anyone has ever even heard about the legalist philosophy. But it did have a strong influence on the beginning of Chinese medicine. And related to that, especially, is the different concept of self in China and in the West, which has a huge implication in the treatment of mental emotional problems. And that's what I've been passionate about in the last 5 or 6 years. That's why I read books like Medicines and Society in late imperial China, for example, a study of physicians in Suzhou.
And so what are the implications then on mental health?
What are the implications of mental health? It's not something I can describe in a few minutes, but in short, in the West, the self is an individual, self-contained, inward-looking self, which is a narrative. It has a past and present and the future. In China, the West is very much the self is very much the Confucian self. It's a socially determined self, which has really no psychological implications as such. And that has major implications. Like, for example, in the field of emotions. In Chinese medicine, emotions are causes of disease. We know from neurophysiology and behavioralism and psychology that emotions are far more than that. Emotions are actually probably what defines us as human beings, and they perform a certain role. I was amazed when I was studying this. I looked into the Western view of emotions from Western philosophers, and I was amazed to find out that every Western philosopher has talked about emotions, from Plato to Sartre. The role of emotions, they do play an important role. The division between the cortex and the limbic system is somewhat artificial. The limbic system and the emotions play a role also in the cortical activity, in their cognition. And that's what I've been absorbed by in the last 5 or 6 years.
And so how will this influence your future activities?
How will it influence my future activities? I've already written something about this in my last book on the psyche, but I've already developed new ideas since writing the book, so I'll hope to write something more on this subject. Just to give you an example, I was in the United States, and after seeing the patients, we discussed the patients. So someone was writing on the board the clinical manifestations of these patients and the diagnosis. And on one side, there was kind of a Western psychological description of this patient. And there was lots of, the whole board was filled with that, what her childhood was like, her relationship with her parents, relationship with her siblings, and the shocks she had in her life, the kind of things we do, which reflects what I said earlier. We see the self as this inward-looking, autonomous self, which has a narrative, a past, a present, and the future, and how the past influences the present. We might take that for granted, but that's not how Chinese medicine works. And then on the right side of the board, there was the Chinese diagnosis. It was liver qi stagnation, and that's it. So the left part, the Western part, the whole board was filled with this psychological narrative. And on the right side was just liver qi stagnation.
And so you feel that was a very limited way of...
I feel that we integrate the two. And that can only be done by generations of practitioners, not one person. I'm not throwing in the answers, I'm just throwing in the problem.
So given you've identified something the profession can look at doing as a whole group, what would your advice be for the profession of the future?
What would my advice be for the profession of the future? As I said, first of all, always Chinese diagnosis. That must be the absolute foundation, As I was talking about heaven and earth, see, before integrating something, you have to master it. So, and I feel that's something that has happened in the West. People integrate Chinese medicine or adapt it, but without really having the foundation of it, what I call heaven and earth. So the main foundations, in my opinion, must always be the Chinese diagnosis. Like, for example, let's say liver qi stagnation. Is the liver qi stagnation of someone who's affected by guilt the same as the liver qi stagnation of someone who's affected by anger? Chinese books don't say that. Is it the same? If not, how do they differ, and do they have different treatment? My answer would be yes, they are different, and they do have different treatment. But this is all, work to be done. And not just by me, by generations of acupuncturists. So as I said, I'm presenting what I perceive to be the problem, or not the problem, the task.
And so given the task is the profession working as a collective, as opposed to individuals in their private practice. How do you see the internet working to support the profession of Chinese medicine?
How do I see the internet working to support the profession of Chinese medicine? Yeah, it has a huge role, and it's a very positive role. It's yes, that's a revolution really in Chinese medicine and in every other field.
In what way has it revolutionised Chinese medicine?
Well, it allows you, first of all, to find information. For example, when I was writing my books, I become very lazy. So if supposing I forgot the Chinese name of a point, it is quicker to go on Google than getting up and finding the book and looking up the point. So, but also it's a great tool in forums, in exchanging information. That's probably the most important aspect of it.
And what's your thoughts about online education?
What's my thought about online education? Yes, I think that's another very fantastic development of the internet. For example, I occasionally take some online courses from the Nanjing College, where I studied, for example. And that's fantastic, you know, to be able in your home to have a short lecture by a Chinese teacher on the Neijing. It's quite amazing.
And what are some of the other benefits?
What are some of the other benefits? Well, as I said, I would say communication among practitioners and exchanging information and opinion.
And so, where do you see yourself in the future, in say 10 years' time?
Where do I myself inside 10 years' time? If I'm alive, I don't know. I will be doing the same things I'm doing now, researching that field, which will take, you know, the rest of my lifetime. The philosophical influence on Chinese medicine, and most of all the concept of self, and how that influences your practice. I think that will be my main focus. Plus, education, you know, I'm with online courses and webinars and also forums and things like that.
Okay. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
Anything else that I wanted to add? No, maybe just reiterating the point about becoming skilled in diagnosis and what I call pattern identification and pulse diagnosis.
I have a final question for you. If you weren't a Grand Master of Chinese medicine, what would you be doing?
If I weren't a Grand Master of Chinese medicine, well, first of all, I wouldn't describe myself as a Grand Master. And I would probably be a Grand Master of salsa dancing. That would be my choice.
That's wonderful.
I hope you enjoyed this free webinar. Please take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel and please share on social media. The world will be a better place when more people know about the benefits of acupuncture.